Hello and welcome to this lecture on the speech and its relationship with the brain. Now, before we begin talking about how language is actually structured, processed, and spoken by a human being, we should first understand what language actually is. So language is a form of structured communication that allows for human interaction. Now, language itself has different components. Well, you have phonemes that are the sound of different types of speech. For example, the difference between the word tap or the word trap. You also have morphemes, which are meaning linguistic units that you can add to words to give them a different meaning. So, for example, the word dog means having one dog, in comparison to dogs, in which you add an S at the end, meaning more than one dog. You finally have something called syntax, which is also known as the construction of full sentences as well. Now, when we hear or see a word that is written down, the brain actually interprets this and moves on to the production of a reply. Now, there are three different components when it comes to how the brain processes speech and prepares a reply. The first thing that happens is something known as speech comprehension. Now, speech comprehension refers to the identification of words from various senses. So, for example, if you hear a word, your auditory area gets activated. If you see a word that's written down somewhere, then your visual area gets activated. Once the brain has identified which source the speech is coming from, we move on to speech composition. Speech composition refers to gathering elements of language in order to compose a response. This means processing the different types of morphemes, syntax, bringing in meaning to your response. And once the response has been composed by the brain, we move on to the final phase, which is known as speech production. Now, speech production is defined as the articulation of the speech muscles in order to produce a reply or the sound that actually comes out of our mouth. Each component of speech has a unique area in the brain where it works. So speech comprehension happens in a different area, as well as composition, as well as the speech production. So now let's move on and see where we can find these areas in the brain. So here I have a lateral section of the left hemisphere of the brain. Now there's a reason that I've chosen the left hemisphere, and that is because it's actually the dominant hemisphere for speech production in about 90% of people that are right-handed and 60% of people that are left-handed. Now, keeping in mind speech comprehension, composition, and production in that order, here I'm going to be highlighting different areas of the brain that are involved in each part of speech. So first I'm going to talk about speech comprehension, which is defined as the identification of speech from various senses. So, what are the different senses that trigger a response for a person to speak? Now, there are three different areas. The first area that I'm going to point out is known as your primary auditory cortex. Now, the primary auditory cortex is located somewhere in this area. So I'm going to go ahead and point that out. This is your primary auditory. The second area I'm going to identify based off speech comprehension is actually vision. So when we see a word that's written somewhere, and that is processed by the primary and secondary visual areas in the occipital lobe. So here we can say this is our primary visual area. So the third and final part of the brain that is used in speech comprehension does not involve vision or hearing. Rather, it involves the sensory areas of our brain. So for example, in Braille, when people that are blind are feeling the different types of dot in different arrangement, this then gets processed by the brain and can allow for a person to produce a response. Now this happens in this area known as the primary somatic sensory area. So this area is known as your primary somatic sensory. So we now move on to speech composition, which I define as gathering elements of language to compose a response. Now, this happens at a very broad and large area, which is located in the temporal lobe, and it is known as the Wernicke's area. Now, the Wernicke's area actually acts as a relay center, and it receives signals from the auditory, somatic, and visual areas of the brain, and then sends that information for it to get processed in order to move on to speech production. So, all the components of language that we talked about, for example, morphemes and syntax, this is the area where all of those get structured and decided on which words will be used to produce an actual response. The signal will then move from the Wernicke's area to an area known as your Broca's area. The Broca's area is mainly used for speech production, which is the articulation of the speech muscles in order to produce a sound or a reply. So the Broca's area is located in the frontal lobe, and this area is actually responsible for the motor speech production, and it works hand in hand with a majority of this area known as your primary motor cortex. Now, the motor cortex actually works in order to provide the different articulation of the different muscles of the speech for voluntary movement in order to produce the words that have been composed by the Wernicke's area. Now that we know the different anatomical features, let's move on to the different types of pathways that the brain uses from different areas of senses and produces a response. So now that we've highlighted the important areas of speech production, it's time to go ahead and look at the different pathways that are followed based off the different senses that we receive. Now, I have drawn in a new anatomical feature of these right over here, and this is known as your arcuate fasciculus. Now, the arcuate fasciculus is basically a bunch of fibers that connect the Wernicke's area to the Broca's area. Now, first, we're going to talk about how information travels when you hear a word. So, once a word is heard, it first goes and gets processed by your primary auditory cortex. Now, from your primary auditory cortex, the signals then travel to your Wernicke's area. After traveling to your Wernicke's areas, the signals will then get sent through the arcuate fasciculus into the Broca's area. And then the Broca's area will then, in turn, send the signals to the motor cortex, which then will carry out the actual production of speech. Now, when we look at the second scenario in which a person has to repeat, or let's say, for example, say a word that they have written, first, the person will see the word, which will then get processed by the primary visual area. From the primary visual area, the fibers, before they move in to the Wernicke's area, they will go through another structure, which is known as the angular gyrus. Now, the angular gyrus is located behind the Wernicke's area, and it has many different functions. But the ones relevant to our video include reading, writing, and interpreting what has been written. So, the extra step that seeing a word follows is going through the angular gyrus. After it has been processed in the angular gyrus, it then moves into the Wernicke's area where speech composition happens, and then through the arcuate fasciculus moves inside into the Broca's area, which works with the motor cortex in order to produce speech or sound. The final one is the somatic sensory area. So once we sense a feeling, for example, people who are blind, when they touch braille, they have a sensation of touch. Once that feeling of touch is processed, it will then go into, again, the Wernicke's area. Like I said, acts as a relay station, travels to the arcuate fasciculus, into the Broca's area, then goes into the motor area if patients need to respond to braille. So these are the different pathways that are related to speech from different sensory areas. Now we're going to move on to disorders of speech. Now, when we describe an acquired disorder of language occurring after brain damage, we can broadly term this as aphasia. Now, aphasia has many different types depending on where the damage has occurred. It's actually really interesting when learning about the different outcomes of different areas of damage. The first type of aphasia that we're going to be talking about is called Broca's aphasia. Now, Broca's aphasia occurs when there has been extensive damage done to the Broca's area. Patients with Broca's aphasia lack smooth flow of speech as well as a diminished ability to repeat words. So, all the signals can be heard, can be seen, can be felt. They are processed at the Wernicke's area, giving you a sort of response that you need to produce, but the actual production of those words will cause a problem. So, in order to help you understand what a patient suffering from a type of aphasia is going through, I'm going to be using this picture. Now, in this picture, we have a patient who is asked to describe his surrounding sceneries. In terms of Broca's aphasia, if we were to ask a person to repeat what he has seen, this is something his speech would look like. Now, in Broca's aphasia, a patient would respond to the exploring scenery in a non-fluent manner. When they speak, it's evident that they're putting in a lot of effort. Even though the Wernicke area has composed what needs to be said, only single words are produced properly. Now, there's a very big misconception in which a lot of students tend to think that if there is damage to the Broca's area, a person will not be able to speak at all. Well, that is not true because the Broca's area, although it is concerned with production of speech, it works hand in hand with the motor cortex in order to produce the speech by articulating the speech muscles. So functions in the speech muscles will be there, but they will only be used for main words. Sentences in this scenario will not be complete. So the second type of aphasia that we're going to be discussing is known as Wernicke's aphasia. Now, Wernicke's aphasia occurs when there is a lesion or damage done to the Wernicke's area. So a patient who has Wernicke's aphasia has a deficit in word comprehension. So speech production will occur normally and fluently, but the words that are spoken, they're going to be jumbled. And deficits can occur in any component of language, as we discussed earlier, in terms of morphemes and syntax. So the signals will be sent. So speech comprehension will happen, but the actual part of speech composition will become impaired. Now, coming back to our scenario, if the patient in this picture is suffering from Wernicke's aphasia, this is how his speech would go. In Wernicke's aphasia, patient's speech is fluent, but due to the decrease in word and sentence composition, the words that are produced are jumbled, and in most cases, they don't make a lot of sense. The third type of aphasia, anomic aphasia. In anomic aphasia, you have a lesion on the angular gyrus. What does that mean? So, we remember from earlier that when a word is heard, it will directly travel to the Wernicke's area, get processed, and then move to the next steps. The visual area, so for example, when you see a word that's written, it must first pass through the angular gyrus in order to reach the Wernicke's area, and at the angular gyrus, it gets processed. Now, if there is a lesion in the angular gyrus, the patient will not be able to understand or interpret words that are written, but the pathway in repeating heard words or feeling sensations, so responding to a sensation of feeling, they will remain intact. The final type of aphasia that we will be discussing is known as global aphasia. So let's say, for example, the damage or lesion is so extensive and so big that it affects a majority of the area of speech. Now, in this type of aphasia, a person loses their ability to comprehend or construct spoken or written words, and they also have difficulty in repeating words or phrases. However, they possess ability to use non-word expressions. So finally, looking at a patient suffering from global aphasia, if we were to ask him to describe the scenery, this would be his response. So basically, a person does not have the ability to speak at all as damage has been done to many areas of the brain. The patient in this scenario will only reply with non-word expressions such as gestures, but they will not be able to vocally produce or explain the surrounding scenery.